The sheriff's words fell like ash on her doorstep, each syllable a small death. Delilah Pike stood in the charred skeleton of what had been her life, watching Otis Ward's weathered hands tremble as he spoke the truth that would remake them both. "We burned your husband by mistake," he said, and the Kansas wind carried his confession across the blackened bones of Ash Hollow, like a prayer seeking forgiveness from a God who had already turned his face away. The morning Delilah Pike learned that her husband's death had been a mistake, she was standing in the ruins of their forge, holding a horseshoe that had survived the fire. The metal was still warm in her palm, though 3 days had passed since the flames died, and she wondered if iron remembered heat the way hearts remembered love, long after the source had turned to ash. Sheriff Otis Ward approached through the smoke-hazed dawn, his boots crunching on the debris of her former life, each step a small percussion of guilt that echoed in the hollow spaces where her kitchen table used to stand. His shadow fell across the twisted remains of her marriage bed, and when she looked up, she saw in his eyes the kind of sorrow that comes not from witnessing tragedy, but from causing it. "Mrs. Pike," he said, and his voice carried the weight of sleepless nights, of whiskey that couldn't wash away the taste of error, of prayers that felt like stones in his throat. She didn't answer, couldn't answer, because words had become foreign things since the fire, and she had learned to speak only in the language of loss, the creak of charred timber, the whisper of ash settling, the silence where Samuel's hammer used to ring against the anvil. Otis removed his hat, revealing hair gone grey, not from age, but from the burden of wearing a badge in a territory where justice moved faster than truth, where good men died because other good men made choices in the dark. The horseshoe grew heavier in her hand, and she realized she was gripping it so tightly that rust was cutting into her palm, drawing blood that fell like small red prayers onto the blackened earth. "We got word that Samuel was running guns to the Cheyenne," Otis continued, his words falling like stones into still water, each one sending ripples through the careful numbness she had built around her heart. "Word came from a man named Jessup. Said he seen your husband loading rifles in the dead of night, said there was a cache hidden in your forge." The sheriff's hands worked the brim of his hat like a rosary, and Delilah could see the truth burning in his eyes before he spoke it, that they had acted on whispers and shadows, that they had brought fire to her door based on the testimony of a man whose word was worth less than the ash now coating her shoes. She wanted to laugh, wanted to scream, wanted to take the horseshoe and beat it against his chest until he understood that Samuel Pike had never touched a gun except to shoe the horses of men who carried them, that her husband's hands knew only the honest work of iron and flame. "Jessup confessed yesterday," Otis said, and now his voice broke like kindling, splintering into pieces that scattered on the wind. "Said he owed money to some men in Dodge, said they told him to point us towards someone, anyone, to take the heat off a real gun-running operation they was protecting." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, acrid and choking, and Delilah felt something inside her chest crack open, not her heart, which had already shattered, but something deeper, some fundamental trust in the order of things that she hadn't even known she possessed. She looked at the horseshoe in her hand, at the blood now mixing with the rust, and thought about how Samuel used to say that iron was honest. It bent when you heated it, held its shape when you let it cool, never pretended to be anything other than what it was. "I come to tell you," Otis said, stepping closer, his boots disturbing the ash that had once been her wedding dress, her mother's china, the letters Samuel had written her during their brief courtship, "that we're gonna make this right." But Delilah knew there was no making right a thing like this, no rebuilding a life from the ashes of a mistake, no resurrection for a man who died because other men were too eager to believe the worst about their neighbors. She dropped the horseshoe, and it landed with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the hollow spaces of her chest, a sound like a coffin lid closing, like a door slamming shut on the life she had known. The sheriff stood there in the ruins of her world, his hat in his hands and his guilt hanging around him like a shroud, and she understood that he had come not just to confess, but to seek absolution from the woman whose life he had helped destroy. When she finally spoke, her voice was as dry and brittle as the charred timber at her feet. "Get off my land," she said, and the words carried the weight of every sleepless night, every tear shed in the darkness, every moment she had spent wondering why God had taken Samuel from her when there was still so much love left to give. Otis Ward nodded, placed his hat back on his head, and walked away through the ash and ruin. But she knew he would be back. Men like him always came back, driven by the kind of guilt that ate at a soul like acid. The kind that demanded payment in sweat and blood, and the slow, painful work of trying to rebuild what could never truly be restored. 3 days later, Delilah woke to the sound of hammering, a rhythm so familiar it pulled her from sleep, like a hand reaching through water to drag her back to the surface of a life she no longer recognized. For a moment, in that space between dream and waking, she thought it was Samuel at the forge, thought the fire had been the nightmare, and this sound was the proof of her deliverance. But when she opened her eyes, she saw only the canvas walls of the tent the church ladies had erected for her in what used to be her garden. The hammering continued, steady and sure, and she pulled on her boots and stepped outside to find Sheriff Otis Ward framing the skeleton of a new house where her old one had stood, his shirt already dark with sweat, though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. He didn't look up when she emerged, didn't acknowledge her presence, just kept driving nails with the kind of focused intensity that spoke of a man trying to build his way out of hell. "I told you to get off my land," she said. But her voice lacked the fire it had carried 3 days before, worn down by sleepless nights and the constant ache of loss that had settled in her bones like winter cold. Otis paused in his hammering, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and finally met her eyes with a gaze that held no apology, no plea for forgiveness, just the steady determination of a man who had found his penance and intended to see it through. "You did," he said, his voice rough from the dust and the early hour, "but I ain't here as sheriff today. I'm here as a man who owes a debt." He gestured toward the lumber stacked nearby, toward the tools laid out with military precision, toward the foundation stones he had somehow managed to set while she slept. "Bought this wood with my own money, gonna build this house with my own hands, and when it's done, it'll be yours free and clear." Delilah stared at the frame, taking shape before her, at the careful measurements and true angles that spoke of a man who knew his way around construction, and felt something twist in her chest. Not gratitude, not yet, but a kind of bewildered recognition that this was how some men chose to bleed. "I don't want your guilt house," she said, but even as the words left her mouth she could hear the lie in them, could feel the way her eyes lingered on the promise of walls and roof, of a place to hang her few remaining possessions, of shelter that wasn't borrowed from the charity of others. Otis resumed his hammering, each blow precise and measured, and she realized he wasn't building just a house, but a kind of prayer, a physical manifestation of remorse that would stand long after words had been forgotten. The sound echoed across the empty lots where other families had once lived, where other dreams had turned to ash, and she wondered if the whole town could hear it. This percussion of penance, this rhythm of a man trying to nail his sins to something solid. "Your husband was a good man," Otis said during a pause in his work, his words falling into the space between hammer blows like stones dropped into a well. "I knew him, traded with him, brought my horse to him for shoeing more times than I can count." He selected another board, measured it against the frame, marked it with a carpenter's pencil that looked small and delicate in his weathered hands. "Samuel Pike never hurt nobody, never raised his voice, never even carried a gun far as I know, and I let fear and bad information turn him into something he wasn't." The admission hung in the air like smoke, and Delilah felt her anger shift and settle, not disappearing, but changing shape, becoming something more complex than the pure fury that had sustained her through the first days after the fire. She watched him work through the morning, watched the way he checked each measurement twice, the way he tested every joint for soundness, the way he built as if his life depended on getting every detail right. There was something almost sacred in his attention to the work, a kind of devotion that reminded her of Samuel at the forge, the way her husband had approached iron with respect and patience, understanding that good work couldn't be rushed, that lasting things required time and care and the willingness to start over when something wasn't right. "Why?" she asked finally, the word escaping before she could stop it, and Otis paused with a nail halfway driven, his hammer suspended in the air like a question mark. "Because," he said, and his voice carried the weight of every sleepless night since the fire, "a man's got to live with what he's done. And I'd rather live with the sound of building than the sound of burning." The sun climbed higher, and still he worked, and still she watched, and somewhere in the rhythm of hammer on nail, in the slow emergence of walls from the ashes of her old life, Delilah Pike began to understand that forgiveness wasn't something you gave or received, but something you built, board by board, nail by nail, in the space between what was lost and what might yet be found. When the church bell rang noon, Otis finally stopped, gathered his tools with the same careful attention he had given to their use, and walked away without a word, leaving behind the skeleton of a promise that would either become a home or stand forever as a monument to the impossibility of making amends for the irreparable. The third morning brought with it a silence so complete that Delilah found herself listening for sounds that would never come again: the ring of hammer on anvil, the hiss of hot metal meeting water, the low rumble of her husband's voice calling her name from the forge. Instead, there was only the measured sound of Otis Ward's boots on the charred ground, arriving as punctually as sunrise, carrying with him the tools of reconstruction and the unbearable weight of his own conscience. She watched him from the window of the temporary shelter the town had provided, a cramped room above the general store that smelled of flour and regret, and wondered if he understood that every nail he drove was also being driven into the coffin of her old life. The sheriff moved with the deliberate care of a man who had learned that haste led to mistakes, and mistakes led to fires that consumed innocent men, and she found herself both grateful for his precision and resentful of the very qualities that made him trustworthy now, when they had failed her so catastrophically before. He had brought lumber this time, real timber that spoke of permanence, rather than the makeshift repairs that had characterized his first attempts at atonement, and as he began to lay out the foundation for what would become the frame of her new house, Delilah felt something shift inside her chest, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first tentative recognition that destruction and creation could exist in the same space. That the same hands that had signed the order leading to her husband's death could also build something that might shelter her from the endless Kansas wind. The irony was not lost on her that a lawman was teaching her about the architecture of second chances, that the man who had enforced the rules that destroyed her world was now showing her how to construct a new one from the ashes of the old. She descended the narrow stairs and stepped into the morning light, her shadow falling across his work like a judgment he had not yet earned the right to escape. And for the first time since the fire, she spoke his name aloud, the word carrying with it all the weight of her unresolved fury and her unwilling recognition of his genuine remorse. "Sheriff Ward," she said, and the formality of it was both a barrier and a bridge, a way of acknowledging his presence without granting him the intimacy of forgiveness. And he looked up from his measuring with eyes that held no expectation of absolution, only the quiet determination of a man who had found his penance in the simple act of building something beautiful from the ruins of his own terrible mistake. The morning stretched between them like a held breath, full of possibilities neither was ready to name, and when she picked up one of the boards he had cut and held it steady while he marked it for the next cut, The gesture was so small and so enormous that neither of them dared to comment on it, afraid that words might shatter whatever fragile understanding was beginning to take root in the scorched earth of their shared tragedy. The sun climbed higher, casting their shadows in sharp relief against the blackened ground, and for the first time since the fire, Delilah allowed herself to imagine that the darkness might not be permanent, that even in the aftermath of the most devastating betrayal, two people might find a way to build something that could withstand the storms that were surely coming. The work continued in a rhythm that spoke of neither friendship nor forgiveness, but of something more fundamental, the human need to create meaning from chaos, to impose order on the random cruelties of existence, to believe that effort and intention could somehow balance the scales of an indifferent universe. Otis measured twice and cut once, his movements economical and sure, while Delilah found herself anticipating his needs, handing him tools before he asked for them, holding boards steady while he secured them, their collaboration wordless and efficient, and charged with an electricity that neither was willing to acknowledge. The frame of the house began to take shape, rising from the foundation like hope itself, stubborn and improbable, and somehow inevitable. And as the day wore on, Delilah realized that she was no longer watching him work, but working alongside him, her hands learning the weight of wood and the satisfaction of construction, her body remembering what it felt like to create rather than simply endure. When the sun reached its zenith and the heat became too much to bear, they retreated to the shade of the one tree that had survived the fire, a gnarled oak that stood like a testament to the possibility of endurance, and shared water from the same canteen without speaking, the silence between them no longer hostile, but simply necessary, a space where grief and guilt could coexist without demanding resolution. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the work resumed, Delilah found herself studying the sheriff's hands, scarred and calloused, marked by years of handling both weapons and tools, hands that had signed death warrants and built cradles, hands that carried the full complexity of a man who had learned too late that the law was not always just and that justice was not always lawful. She thought of her husband's hands, smooth and strong from years at the forge, hands that had shaped metal into beauty and utility, hands that had touched her with a tenderness that made her believe in the possibility of permanent love, and she wondered if it was a betrayal to find comfort in the competence of these different hands, these guilty hands that were nevertheless building her a place to call home. The question hung in the air between them like smoke, acrid and persistent, and when Otis finally spoke, his voice was rough with the effort of saying what needed to be said without expecting anything in return. "I know this doesn't bring him back," he said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the work before him. "And I know it doesn't make what happened right. But I need you to know that I'll keep coming back until it's finished, until you have a home again, because it's the only way I know how to live with what I've done." The words settled between them like dust after an explosion, and Delilah felt something crack open inside her chest. Not the clean break of forgiveness, but the messy, complicated fracture of a heart learning to hold multiple truths at once, that she could hate what he had done and still recognize the sincerity of his remorse, that she could grieve her husband and still accept help from the man whose mistake had made her a widow, that the human heart was vast enough to contain contradictions that would have seemed impossible before tragedy taught her the true elasticity of the soul. She did not speak, could not speak, but when she handed him the next board, her fingers brushed his for just a moment, and in that brief contact was neither forgiveness nor absolution, but something more precious and more fragile. The acknowledgement that they were both human beings trying to find their way through the wreckage of a world that had proven itself capable of casual cruelty and unexpected grace in equal measure. The fourth week brought rain, a steady downpour that turned the construction site into a muddy testament to the persistence of both weather and human determination. and Delilah watched from her window as Sheriff Ward continued his work despite the conditions, his hat brim channeling water in steady streams while he covered the exposed framework with canvas tarps that snapped and billowed in the wind like the sails of a ship navigating treacherous waters. There was something almost biblical about his dedication, she thought, something that spoke of penance and redemption and the ancient human belief that suffering could somehow balance the cosmic scales, and she found herself putting on her rain slicker and stepping out into the storm, not because she had forgiven him, but because she could not bear to watch him shoulder the burden of rebuilding her life entirely alone. The rain was cold and insistent, soaking through her clothes within minutes, but there was something cleansing about it too, as if the sky itself was washing away the ash and soot that had clung to everything since the fire, preparing the ground for whatever was to come next. They worked together in the downpour, their movements careful and deliberate on the slippery ground, and Delilah discovered that there was a strange intimacy in shared misery, a camaraderie that arose from facing the same elemental challenges side by side, even when those challenges were of human rather than natural origin. The sheriff's presence had become as much a part of her daily routine as sunrise and sunset, a constant that she had stopped questioning, even as she continued to wrestle with the implications of accepting help from the man whose mistake had cost her everything she held dear. She had begun to notice things about him that had nothing to do with his role in her tragedy, the way he favored his left leg on cold mornings, suggesting an old injury that had never quite healed, the careful way he handled the tools, as if he understood that they were instruments of creation rather than mere objects, the quiet satisfaction that crossed his face when a joint fit perfectly or a measurement proved true. These observations felt like small betrayals of her grief, evidence that she was beginning to see him as a man rather than simply the embodiment of institutional failure, and she resented the complexity of her own emotions even as she found herself grateful for his unwavering presence. The house was taking shape now, its skeleton fleshed out with walls and the promise of a roof, and as they worked to secure the framework against the storm, Delilah found herself imagining what it would look like when it was finished. Windows that would frame the sunrise, a kitchen where she might learn to cook for one instead of two, a bedroom where she would have to face the vast emptiness of a bed meant for sharing. The prospect was both terrifying and oddly comforting, the idea that she might have a space that was entirely her own, unmarked by memories of her husband's presence, a place where she could begin the long process of learning who she was when she was not half of a pair. The sheriff seemed to understand the weight of what they were building, the way that each board and nail represented not just shelter, but the possibility of a future she had not dared to imagine. And his movements carried a reverence that spoke of a man who understood that he was not just constructing a house, but helping to rebuild a life that his actions had shattered. As the rain continued to fall and the afternoon light began to fade, they found themselves working by lamplight, the golden glow creating a circle of warmth and purpose in the midst of the storm. And Delilah realized that this was the first time since the fire that she had felt truly present in her own life, engaged in something that required her full attention and participation rather than simply enduring the passage of time. The sheriff's hands moved with practiced efficiency, and she found herself matching his rhythm, their collaboration becoming more fluid and natural with each passing hour, as if they were learning a dance whose steps were written in the language of construction and mutual necessity. When he accidentally dropped a hammer, and she caught it before it could fall into the mud, their eyes met for a moment, and in that brief exchange was a recognition that went beyond words. The acknowledgement that they had become partners in this enterprise, bound together not by choice, but by circumstance, and the shared understanding that some things could only be built by two people working toward the same goal. The storm began to subside as evening approached, the rain softening to a gentle patter that drummed against the canvas tarps like fingers on a tabletop. And as they secured the last of the protective coverings, Delilah found herself reluctant to end the day's work, to return to the solitude of her temporary quarters and the endless cycle of grief and memory that awaited her there. The sheriff seemed to sense her hesitation, and when he suggested that they sit for a moment under the shelter they had created, she found herself nodding, grateful for the excuse to postpone the return to loneliness. They sat on upturned crates, listening to the rain and watching the lamplight flicker across the walls they had raised together, and for the first time since the fire, Delilah felt something that might have been peace, a quiet satisfaction in the work they had accomplished and the progress they had made towards something that might eventually resemble a home. "He would have liked this," she said suddenly, the words emerging without conscious thought, and she was surprised to realize that she was speaking of her husband without the crushing weight of grief that usually accompanied any mention of him, that she could think of him in connection with this new house without feeling like she was betraying his memory. The sheriff nodded, understanding without explanation that she was offering him something precious, a glimpse of the man whose death had brought them together, a recognition that her husband's spirit might somehow be present in the work they were doing, blessing rather than condemning their collaboration. "He always said that a house wasn't just shelter," she continued, her voice soft in the lamplight, "but a promise that tomorrow would come, that there would be a future worth building for." The words hung in the air between them, and Delilah realized that she was not just talking about her husband, but about herself, about the possibility that she might once again believe in the promise of tomorrow, that the future might hold something more than just the endless repetition of loss and regret. The house was nearly finished when the first snow fell, dusting the completed roof and walls with a pristine whiteness that made the structure look like something from a fairy tale, a cottage that had materialized from the dreams of someone who still believed in happy endings despite all evidence to the contrary. Delilah stood in what would soon be her kitchen, watching Sheriff Ward install the final window, his breath visible in the cold air as he worked with the same meticulous care that had characterized every aspect of the construction. And she marveled at the transformation that had taken place not just in the physical space, but in herself, in the way she had learned to inhabit her grief without being consumed by it, to carry her love for her husband alongside her growing appreciation for the man who had helped her build a new life from the ashes of the old. The window slid into place with a satisfying click, and suddenly the room was flooded with light, the winter sun streaming through the glass to illuminate walls that smelled of fresh wood and new beginnings. And Delilah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger and sorrow that had lived there since the fire. The sheriff stepped back to admire his work, and she saw in his face the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, the pride of a craftsman who had poured his skill and his guilt and his hope into every joint and corner, creating something that was both functional and beautiful, a testament to the possibility of redemption through honest labor and unwavering dedication. He had aged during the months of construction, she realized, the lines around his eyes deepening with the weight of responsibility and remorse. But there was something lighter about him too, as if the act of building had somehow rebuilt him as well, giving him a purpose that went beyond the enforcement of laws that had proven themselves fallible and sometimes cruel. She wanted to thank him, to find words that could encompass the magnitude of what he had done for her, but language seemed inadequate to the task, too small and clumsy to contain the complex emotions that swirled between them like snow in the wind. Instead, she walked to the stove he had installed the previous week, a beautiful cast-iron piece that he had somehow procured from a supplier in Kansas City, and began to prepare coffee. The simple domestic ritual feeling, both foreign and familiar, After months of living in temporary quarters and eating meals prepared by well-meaning neighbors who treated her like an invalid rather than a woman learning to be whole again. The sheriff watched her movements with something that might have been wonder, as if he was seeing her truly inhabit the space for the first time, and when she handed him a steaming cup, their fingers brushed in a contact that was no longer accidental but deliberate, a small acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between them through shared labor and mutual understanding. The coffee was strong and bitter, warming them from the inside as they stood in the kitchen they had created together, and Delilah realized that this was what home felt like, not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of possibility. Not the erasure of the past, but the foundation for a future that could honor what had been lost while embracing what might yet be found. "I need to tell you something," the sheriff said, his voice carrying a weight that made her look up from her coffee, and she saw in his eyes the same vulnerability that had been there on that first morning when he had confessed his role in her husband's death. The raw honesty of a man who had learned that truth was the only currency that mattered in the economy of the heart. "I didn't just come here every day because of guilt," he continued, his words careful and measured, as if he was afraid that speaking too quickly might shatter whatever fragile understanding they had built. "I came because being here, working with you, building this, it made me remember what it felt like to be useful, to create something good, instead of just enforcing rules that sometimes destroy innocent people." The admission hung between them like a bridge, and Delilah felt her heart begin to race, not with fear, but with the terrifying possibility that she might not be the only one who had been changed by their unlikely partnership, that the man who had helped her rebuild her life might have been rebuilding his own in the process. She set down her coffee cup and walked to the window he had just installed, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the fire that had destroyed everything she thought she knew about safety and justice, the grief that had nearly consumed her, the slow process of learning to trust again, to hope again, to believe that the future might hold something more than just survival. The sheriff joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and when he spoke again, his voice was so soft that she had to strain to hear it over the whisper of snow against glass. "I know I have no right to ask this," he said, "and I know that what I did can never be undone, but I need you to know that these months, building this house with you, have been the most meaningful of my life. And if you could ever find it in your heart to let me be part of whatever comes next, I would spend every day trying to be worthy of that gift." The words settled around them like snow, soft and transformative, covering the familiar landscape of their relationship with something new and unexpected, and Delilah felt the last of her resistance crumble, not into forgiveness. That would take time, perhaps years, but into something more complex and more honest, the recognition that love could grow in the most unlikely soil, that two people broken by the same tragedy could find in each other not just healing, but the possibility of a happiness neither had dared to imagine. She turned to face him, this man who had destroyed her world and then helped her build a new one, and saw in his eyes the same mixture of hope and terror that she felt in her own heart, the knowledge that they stood at the threshold of something that could either redeem them both or destroy what little peace they had managed to create. The snow continued to fall outside the window, blanketing the world in pristine whiteness, and when she reached for his hand, the gesture was both an ending and a beginning, the final piece of the foundation they had been building together, not just in wood and stone, but in the more fragile and more enduring materials of trust and understanding and the radical possibility of love born from the ashes of loss. The house was finished, but their story was just beginning, and as they stood together in the kitchen where she would learn to cook for two again, where they would share meals and conversations and the quiet intimacy of ordinary days, Delilah understood that some things could only be built by two people willing to work together despite the weight of the past. that forgiveness was not a destination, but a daily choice, and that home was not a place, but a decision to keep building, keep trusting, keep believing in the possibility of tomorrow, even when yesterday had taught them that the world was capable of casual cruelty and unexpected grace in equal measure.